In July of 2021, American President Joe Biden was asked whether a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was inevitable. This was his response.
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
As we now know, that is absolutely not what happened. In fact, within 2 months, the Taliban had taken the Afghan capital, Kabul, and the Americans were forced to undergo an astonishingly incompetent and humiliating withdrawal. The withdrawal was so badly executed that the Americans would end up leaving behind about $80 billion worth of weapons and equipment. For example, this is an American helicopter being flown by the Taliban. All that raises the question of how did the Taliban do it? What happened to those 300,000 soldiers that Joe Biden referred to? Why couldn't they keep control of the country? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have a quick overview of what happened, the history of the war in Afghanistan. For a long time, Afghanistan was known as the graveyard of empires, and that is for good reason. Afghanistan is an unforgiving place. Its landscape is extremely difficult to traverse, with mountains, steep valleys and desert. Its climate is very harsh, with extreme heat and cold. Those harsh conditions have always given the resistant local defender a significant advantage over any invading army. That meant that Afghanistan was always very difficult to control from afar. For much of history, it was a borderland, a territory that armies would pass through on their way to richer, more fertile regions such as India or Persia. The modern nation of Afghanistan got its independence from Britain in 1919. At the time, the nation was ruled by Amanullah Khan, a forward-thinking liberal man who implemented ambitious reforms such as the education of women and the establishment of a constitution. However, after only 9 years of independence, civil war broke out and King Amanullah was forced to abdicate. Eventually, in 1933, the throne was taken by Zahir Shah, and his reign would see a period of relative stability, the longest in Afghanistan's history. During that time, Afghanistan was relatively liberal, and Zahir Shah established a parliamentary democracy and gave women the right to vote. However, the stability was not to last, as Zahir was overthrown in 1973 by his cousin and former Prime Minister, Dawood Khan. Then, 5 years later, Khan himself was overthrown, and the Afghan state began to fall apart. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded, starting a brutal conflict that would last for 9 years and kill about 10% of the Afghan population. Eventually, the Soviet Union gave up on the conflict and withdrew in 1989. However, even with the Soviet Union gone, the civil war didn't stop. Throughout the 1990s, a huge number of different militia groups led by powerful local warlords fought for control over the country. By 1997, the most powerful group were the Taliban, an extremist Islamic movement that was supported by Pakistan. They controlled about 85% of the country and the capital, Kabul. Under Taliban rule, Afghanistan became a hub of Islamic terrorism, a training ground for jihadists that wanted to wage war on the West. There were many terrorist groups operating, but the most important was Al-Qaeda, led by Osama Bin Laden. Bin Laden was from an incredibly wealthy Saudi family with close ties to the royals. His father had been a construction mogul, and his company built some of the most famous Saudi landmarks. When his father died, Osama bin Laden inherited a huge fortune which he would use to fund his terrorist activities. In 1996, he published a declaration of war against America, arguing that it had long committed crimes against Muslims. Over the next few years, bin Laden would orchestrate several terrorist attacks against American targets. The first was in 1998, when Al-Qaeda detonated 2 truck bombs at American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The attack killed over 200 people and dramatically increased bin Laden's profile. Then, in October of 2000, Al-Qaeda attacked a US Navy ship in Yemen, blowing a hole in the side of the ship and killing 15 American servicemen. However, those attacks were small compared with what was to come. In September of 2001, Al-Qaeda carried out the worst terrorist attack in history when they hijacked passenger planes and flew them into the World Trade Center. The attack in New York killed almost 3,000 people and left the world stunned. For the Americans, it wasn't immediately clear how to respond. Bin Laden had planned and orchestrated the attack from Afghanistan, but he wasn't technically part of the Afghan government, and none of the terrorists that had been involved were Afghans. It's important to remember that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda weren't the same thing, and in fact, they hadn't always had good relations. The Taliban was the closest thing that Afghanistan had to a state and was effectively the government. That said, the country was in a state of civil war, and the Taliban only controlled about 85% of the country. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, was simply a terrorist organization focused on its war against America. It existed in Afghanistan at the pleasure of the Taliban, who theoretically could have expelled it from the country. The Americans did actually enter into talks with the Taliban to see if they could be persuaded to hand over bin Laden, but the negotiation came to nothing. In the end, with the Taliban refusing to cooperate, the Americans decided to topple them from power by supporting the coalition of Afghan warlords that they were fighting. The American support was extremely effective, and within about 2 months the Taliban had been toppled at the cost of only 13 American lives. That said, the Americans didn't manage to achieve their primary objective, to kill or capture Osama Bin Laden. Unfortunately for the Americans, little thought had been given to what to do after the Taliban had been ousted. If the Americans left, the Taliban would likely return, and Afghanistan would simply continue its civil war. It was decided that American-led international forces would remain in the country and try to develop the rule of law and a democratic government. On December the 22nd, Hamid Karzai was made president of the country and would remain in office for about 12 years. The Taliban had been badly weakened, but not totally eradicated. Most of them had fled to Pakistan, where they found safe haven where they could regroup and rearm. As they increased in strength, they began a guerrilla war against the Western-backed government. To counter that, the international coalition began to train and equip an Afghan army that in theory would fight the Taliban and bring security to the country. For the next few years, Afghanistan was in a very precarious state, with the weak central government just about able to remain in power, but also unable to bring complete security. There was constant violence, and the Taliban was able to gain control of a lot of territory. In 2009, American President Barack Obama sent an additional 30,000 US troops to try to eradicate the Taliban for good, but it didn't work. The whole time, coalition soldiers were getting killed by booby traps and ambushes. Eventually, in 2014, a full 13 years after the initial invasion, the majority of the international coalition pulled their forces out. The US and the UK kept some forces there, but dramatically reduced the number, and from now on they would only be involved in supporting non-combat roles. There were actually fears that the Afghan state would collapse then, but in the end, with American and British support, it was just about able to cling on. Over time, that support became politically unpopular in the USA. Many Americans began to doubt whether anything was actually being achieved with their taxpayer dollars. In 2016, the US presidency was won by Donald Trump, who had always been skeptical of American involvement in Afghanistan. Under his leadership, America signed a peace treaty with the Taliban in February of 2020, aimed at ending the war. In return for the Taliban promising to prevent terrorism in the country, the US agreed to totally withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. Throughout 2021, the coalition forces withdrew. In May, the last NATO forces were gone. Now only American forces were left. At the start of May, the country looked something like this, with the government and the Taliban controlling roughly equal amounts of the country, and with a lot of areas contested. However, that map was going to change very fast. In May, the US pulled out of their airbase in Kandahar province. In July, they left Bagram airbase just north of Kabul. Astonishingly, the Americans left the airbase at 3 in the morning and didn't tell the Afghan forces that they'd been fighting with. The Afghans only found out when they woke up. The evacuation of Bagram airbase was a good indicator of just how disorganized and chaotic the withdrawal was going to be. Now, the Americans only had a presence in the capital, Kabul. All the while, the Taliban were taking large amounts of territory. For example, on the 14th of July, they captured Spin Boldak, a crucial border crossing into Pakistan. By August, the Afghan army was in a state of total collapse. In many places, it began to melt away as local commanders realized that the Taliban were going to win and struck deals with them. Many provinces fell to the Taliban with almost no resistance as the Afghan army lost the will to fight. On the 15th of August, the Taliban entered Kabul, and what followed was absolute pandemonium and chaos. The Americans hadn't totally evacuated the city, and so were going to have to get their forces out while it was under Taliban control. To make the situation worse, there was a huge number of Afghan nationals that had helped the Americans and now feared reprisals from the Taliban. In theory, America wanted to get those people out too, but the situation was so chaotic that there was no procedure to make that happen. Military helicopters were frantically evacuating staff from the US Embassy. The Americans had about 5,000 troops in Kabul, and they were trying to keep control of a small part of the city, including the airport. There was a state of mass panic within the civilian population as people feared what would happen under Taliban rule. Many people tried to force their way onto American planes. One famous piece of footage showed hundreds of people desperately clinging onto an American transport plane in the hope of getting out of Afghanistan. Several people died in the chaos, including one person that managed to get into the plane's landing gear. The Americans and British would take about 2 weeks to evacuate Kabul in what would become one of the most humiliating moments in American history. On the 26th of August, a terrorist attack by Islamic State killed almost 200 people, including 13 American servicemen. The last American evacuation flight was on the 31st of August, and with that, the Taliban had almost total control of the country. America's war in Afghanistan was over, having been a bitter failure. It had had troops in Afghanistan for 20 years and had nothing to show for it. The Taliban had been in power before the Americans arrived, and they were in power after they left. So, that is what happened, the total collapse of the Afghan army and government in only a few weeks. What accounts for that stunning defeat? Well, probably the most important thing to focus on is just how weak and corrupt the Afghan state was. To understand the Afghan government, you need to understand the circumstances in which it was born, so we need to take a closer look at what we generally refer to as the American invasion of Afghanistan. In my view, to call America's intervention in 2001 an invasion is actually somewhat of a mischaracterization. To see what I mean, you only need to look at the number of troops that America sent to Afghanistan compared with, say, Iraq. The American invasion of Iraq was most definitely an invasion. They sent almost 500,000 troops to overwhelm and occupy the country. In Afghanistan, by contrast, the US sent about 5,000, 1% as many men. Rather than think of it as an invasion, I think it's best to think of it as America backing aside in an already ongoing civil war. Before 2001, Afghanistan was in a state of civil war between the Taliban and a coalition of warlords known as the Northern Alliance. The Taliban did control the majority of the country, but only about 85%. The conflict was essentially a stalemate and had been for about 5 years, with neither the Taliban nor the Northern Alliance able to win decisively. When the US got involved in late 2001, what it was doing was tipping the scales in favour of the Northern Alliance warlords, allowing them to defeat the Taliban. The vast majority of the fighting on the ground was done by the Northern Alliance. The US helped them win by providing air support, special forces and money. For example, an American, maybe a CIA operative, would be on the ground communicating with one of the Afghan warlords who would tell the CIA agent where they wanted American airstrikes. With that assistance, the warlords were able to defeat the Taliban and drive them out of the country. For the Americans, that was very convenient and meant that they only had to send about 5,000 troops and only took 13 casualties. However, it also meant that when the US wanted to make an Afghan government that it could support, there was no way to do it without the buy-in of the Northern Alliance warlords. They had played a major role in driving the Taliban out of the country, and they were the men that actually controlled the country on the ground. Of course, from their perspective, they were the ones that had actually won the war. As you can imagine, given that those men were Afghan warlords, many of them were extremely unsavory, dubious characters. To give you a sense of what they were like, I'd like to have a closer look at some of them. First, let's talk about Abdul Rashid Dostum. Dostum had a lot of power with ethnic Uzbeks who mainly live in the north of Afghanistan. At the height of his power, he could count on the support of several million Uzbeks. He had been involved in the Afghan civil war for decades. In fact, he had actually fought for the Soviets in the 1980s. Dostum, like the other warlords, had his own private army to keep control of his territory. He probably commanded about 10,000 men and also had some old Soviet equipment like T-55 tanks. Some of the warlords even had helicopters. Like many of the Afghan warlords, Dostum was essentially a psychopath. For example, at one point he wanted to marry his 15-year-old girlfriend. He did already have 2 wives, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to take a third. Unfortunately for Dostum, to do that he needed the consent of his 2 existing wives, and they refused. His solution was to force his personal chauffeur to marry his 15-year-old girlfriend so that they would be able to keep seeing each other in secret. The chauffeur refused to marry the girl, and so Dostum brutally punished him. He and his bodyguards repeatedly raped and tortured the chauffeur over a period of several days. Eventually, they left him chained by his lip to the inside of a truck container. That kind of psychopathic behavior was typical of Dostum, who would regularly use sexual violence against his political opponents. He was also a paedophile who raped children. Unfortunately, Dostum is exactly the type of character that the Americans were cooperating with, both to get rid of the Taliban and in the government afterwards. He had been fighting the civil war prior to 2001, so when the Americans arrived wanting to drive the Taliban out, it was people like Dostum that they had to support. They would give him money and carry out airstrikes where he told them to. It was his men that had actually driven the Taliban out of the country, which meant that the US had no choice but to include him in the new Afghan government that they were creating. Dostum actually became vice president in 2014 and a marshal in the army. Another warlord was Abdul Razik. During the American occupation, Razik became the chief of police for Kandahar province and was one of the most powerful security officials. Like Dostum, he was extremely corrupt and perhaps even more psychopathic. For example, he would torture his prisoners in dungeons and perform extrajudicial killings. His behavior was so bad that the UN wanted him to be prosecuted, and the Americans banned the transfer of detainees to his prisons. He was also corrupt, stealing a huge amount of money. For example, he took a lot of money that the government was supposed to be receiving in taxes at the Spin Boldak crossing into Pakistan. Razik was also directly involved in drug smuggling. As you can imagine, with men like that around, Afghan politics was like something out of Game of Thrones. Afghanistan was a balkanized land where power was determined by how many troops a man had at his command. Given that those types of men were a big part of the Afghan government, it shouldn't be a surprise that it fell apart. Many of the warlords didn't like each other, and some of them had even fought in the past. The only thing that had been uniting them in the first place was that they were fighting the Taliban, and even that wasn't true of all of them. I hope that now you've seen some of the people that were involved in the Afghan government, you can see that to call it corrupt really doesn't do it justice. It was really a Frankenstein institution, a strange group of ex-warlords, technocrats and Western do-gooders, often with conflicting objectives and motives. Many of those that were part of it had extremely little commitment to its success. For some of them, it was essentially just a vehicle to steal international aid money. As you can imagine, that meant that it was an extremely weak institution, and that is most visible when we take a look at how it functioned financially. Throughout its entire existence, the Afghan government was totally dependent on American money in order to be able to keep the lights on. For example, in 2017, total government spending by the Afghan government was about $11 billion. Only a quarter of that came from tax income, with $8.5 billion, or 3/4, coming from international aid, mostly from America. Of that, about 40% was spent on the security services, the army and the police. Exactly what the money was getting spent on is impossible to know, but what is certain is that a huge amount of it was getting wasted and stolen. One of the most common ways that money would get stolen was that a corrupt official would receive money to run a school or hospital, but would then just pocket it. Paraphrasing from a 2016 American report, the lack of security made it impossible to inspect US-funded reconstruction projects. Millions of dollars were getting stolen, and the government was paying for numerous non-existent ghost schools, ghost teachers, and ghost students. At times, the corruption was so egregious that it bordered on the absurd. For example, the trucking system that supplied American forces ended up sending huge amounts of money to all sorts of dodgy characters. In the words of one report, the trucking system fueled a vast protection racket run by a shadowy network of warlords, strongmen, commanders, and corrupt Afghan officials. One owner of a trucking company actually managed to get his hands on over $160 million of American taxpayers' money. However, just looking at how much aid money was going to the government actually understates how much help it was getting. That's because at the same time as the US was financing the Afghan government, it was also spending a huge amount of money to keep American troops there to help with the fight against the Taliban. For example, from 2016 to 2020, it was spending about $40 billion per year on the military forces that it had there. Another major issue was that the government didn't even truly control the areas that it did on paper. For example, here is a map from 2017. Supposedly, the majority of the country was under government control, but in reality, its power in those regions was very tenuous. Those areas did have some government troops, but they often just stayed put in their bases and outposts rather than project the power of the central government. It was the case in some villages that the government would control it during the day and then retreat in the evening, and then the Taliban would control it during the night. Of course, ultimately the reason that the Taliban won control of Afghanistan was because they defeated the Afghan National Army, so we need to take a closer look at that. As the old saying goes, an army is a reflection of the government that it represents, and given that the Afghan government was so corrupt and dysfunctional, it shouldn't surprise you to learn that the army also had major problems. On paper, the Afghan military had more than 200,000 men at its disposal, which would have made a formidable fighting force. However, in reality, there were far fewer than that. That was because many of the soldiers were ghost soldiers that didn't exist. A local commander would claim that he had 1,000 men in order to receive the salaries, food, clothing and equipment for 1,000 men. In reality, there might only be 100 or 200 soldiers. The commander would then pocket the money and sell the equipment on the black market. Much of that equipment would then end up in the hands of the Taliban. The ghost soldiers was a problem not just for the money that was lost, but also because it meant that nobody really knew the capacity of the Afghan army. One American report wrote, "Neither the United States nor its Afghan allies truly know how many Afghan soldiers and police are available for duty, or by extension, the true nature of their operational capabilities. What soldiers there were often extremely demoralized and not particularly committed to the Afghan government. That was in large part because the casualty rate was extremely high. According to Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, about 9,000 men were getting killed each year. Another factor was that many of them weren't getting paid. The money that was intended to be used to pay the soldiers' salaries was often stolen. That was also the case with the other supplies that the men needed, such as food and ammunition. Given that the soldiers were getting such a bad deal, you won't be surprised to learn that many of them deserted. At one point, about 5,000 men per month were leaving. Even when men didn't desert, they would often just leave after their service contract was over. That was a big problem because money had been invested in training those men, so their experience was lost. Another enormous problem was that the army was built in such a way that it was dependent on American support. No attention was given to making a military that could stand on its own. Essentially, the Afghan army was made in the image of an American force with high-tech equipment, a long supply chain and complex tactics. Trying to get an army of mostly illiterate men to operate in such a way was never going to work. In hindsight, it really is a bit crazy how the Americans built a force that was so intrinsically dependent on themselves, knowing that they didn't want to be there forever. For example, the Afghans were given American helicopters, which meant that they would always be dependent on expensive American contractors to maintain them. Initially, the Afghans had been using the Mi-17 Russian-made helicopter, which was relatively easy to maintain. It was hoped that the Afghans themselves would be able to maintain them by about 2019. However, the Americans didn't want the Afghans to be using Russian-made helicopters, and so in 2016 they decided to change what they were providing. They decided to provide the UH-60 Black Hawk, which is incredibly complicated and takes years to train someone to use. The full capacity of such an advanced weapon could never be realized because the Afghan military was so far from a meritocracy. For example, it was often the case that younger, more competent men were bypassed for important positions because respecting elders is such an important part of Afghan culture. Overall, the military that America was trying to build was far more high-tech and complicated than it should have been, and was always going to be dependent on them. Given that the Americans knew that they wanted to leave eventually, that was a very foolish decision. While everything I've said so far is a big part of why the Taliban won, there might be a different, far less talked about reason that's even more important: the role of Pakistan. I think that the role that Pakistan has played throughout the conflict cannot be overstated. Throughout the whole of its existence, the Taliban has been helped by Pakistan in a whole host of ways. Many of its recruits are from the Islamic schools in the northwest of Pakistan, and the Pakistani government would actually facilitate their travel to join the Taliban. Pakistan also provided the Taliban with weapons and money. It played a big role in the Taliban's success in the 1990s when they almost defeated the Warlord alliance. Then, after the Taliban were defeated in 2001, it was to Pakistan that they fled. That was incredibly valuable to the Taliban, allowing them to regroup and rearm. Without the ability to seek safe haven in Pakistan in 2001, there is a good chance that the Taliban as an organisation would have been totally eradicated and ceased to exist. Because they could go to Pakistan, they were able to rebuild themselves and eventually launch the insurgency in the mid-2000s. During that insurgency, they continued to get support from Pakistan. All that begs the question of why did Pakistan do that? What's in it for them? The primary reason that Pakistan has helped the Taliban so much is because of its ongoing rivalry with its enemy, India. Since the two countries came into existence, India and Pakistan have been bitter enemies and have fought 4 wars. Because of that rivalry, one of Pakistan's greatest fears is that India would gain influence in Afghanistan, which would leave it surrounded by hostile neighbours on both sides. To prevent that, it supported the Taliban in Afghanistan in the hope that they would take power and Afghanistan would become a client state. Pakistan's worries about India gaining influence in Afghanistan weren't entirely unfounded. For example, in the 1990s, India was actually funding the Warlord alliance that was fighting the Taliban. Seen from that lens, the decades-long conflict in Afghanistan can be seen, at least in part, as a proxy war between India and Pakistan. So, coming back to the question of why did the Taliban win, I think that Pakistan is a huge part of the answer. As you can imagine, Pakistan is much more willing and more able to support its client group in Afghanistan than America ever would have been. With such long-term consistent support and a weak divided adversary, one wonders if it was always inevitable that the Taliban would win.